Senator Sheldon Whitehouse stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee with a deliberate composure that signaled the presence of devastating evidence. In his left hand, he held a financial document detailing transactions totaling $847,000. In his right hand, he gripped a small audio recording device that contained approximately 3 minutes of conversation recorded during a 2013 telephone call between Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi and a Trump Organization attorney. The subsequent 88 seconds would fundamentally dismantle the carefully constructed narrative that Bondi had maintained throughout her confirmation hearing for the position of United States Attorney General. The intersection of the financial records and the audio evidence created an evidentiary framework from which no credible defense could emerge. The packed Senate chamber, filled with journalists representing major international news organizations and political observers from across the ideological spectrum, recognized immediately that they were witnessing a career-defining confrontation. Bondi sat at the witness table, maintaining the professional demeanor that had characterized her 20-year career as a prosecutor and state attorney general. Behind her, members of the White House counsel's office exchanged concerned glances, their body language betraying an awareness that the confirmation process had reached a critical inflection point. Republican senators who had spent the previous day praising Bondi's qualifications and experience now leaned forward in their seats, uncertain about what evidence Whitehouse possessed, but recognizing the gravity of the moment from his methodical presentation style. The stakes extended beyond Bondi's individual confirmation. As the designated leader of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General position represented the most significant law enforcement authority in the federal government. Questions about financial impropriety and potential corruption at this level carried implications for the entire administration's credibility. Democratic senators had spent weeks investigating Bondi's record as Florida Attorney General, focusing particular attention on her decision not to pursue fraud charges against Trump University despite receiving numerous constituent complaints and having authority to join a multi-state investigation. Before examining the specific evidence that Whitehouse presented and the mechanisms through which it destroyed Bondi's confirmation prospects, viewers should subscribe to this channel to ensure continued access to comprehensive political analysis. Please indicate your geographic location in the comments section to help us understand our audience demographics and tailor content accordingly. Your engagement supports the production of detailed investigative journalism that holds public officials accountable to constitutional principles and ethical standards. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse brought to this confrontation a professional background that uniquely positioned him to present complex financial evidence effectively. Having served as Rhode Island's United States Attorney before his election to the Senate, Whitehouse possessed prosecutorial experience that informed his questioning technique. His tenure on the Senate Judiciary Committee had established his reputation as a methodical investigator who preferred documented evidence to rhetorical flourishes. Colleagues on both sides of the aisle acknowledged his preparation standards, even when they disagreed with his political conclusions. Whitehouse's investigative approach reflected his understanding that effective oversight required comprehensive documentation. For the previous 6 weeks, his staff had worked with financial analysts to reconstruct money flows between various entities associated with Trump properties and organizations connected to Bondi's political operations. They had filed numerous public records requests with Florida state agencies. They had interviewed former employees of both the Florida Attorney General's office and Trump Organization subsidiaries. The evidence Whitehouse now prepared to present represented the culmination of this extensive investigation. Seated across from him, Pam Bondi embodied the combination of prosecutorial experience and political loyalty that had made her attractive to the incoming administration. At 60 years old, Bondi brought 8 years of experience as Florida's Attorney General, during which she had overseen significant consumer protection initiatives and criminal prosecutions. Her supporters emphasized her qualifications, noting her extensive trial experience and her management of a state law enforcement agency with thousands of employees. Her career included notable achievements in combating human trafficking, addressing the opioid crisis, and implementing criminal justice reforms. However, Bondi's record also included the controversial decision regarding Trump University that had attracted sustained scrutiny. In 2013, while serving as Florida Attorney General, Bondi had declined to join a multi-state investigation into allegations of fraud against Trump University despite receiving over 20 constituent complaints. This decision occurred in close temporal proximity to a $25,000 contribution from the Donald J. Trump Foundation to a political committee supporting Bondi's re-election campaign. Both Bondi and Trump had maintained that these events were unconnected, characterizing the timing as coincidental. The confirmation hearing had addressed this issue repeatedly over the previous 2 days. Bondi had testified that her office conducted an independent review of the Trump University complaints and determined that Florida lacked sufficient evidence to warrant joining the multi-state investigation. She emphasized that attorneys general routinely make prosecutorial discretion decisions based on their assessment of available evidence and likelihood of successful prosecution. She noted that the Trump Foundation contribution had been unsolicited and that her campaign finance committee had accepted it without her direct involvement in the decision-making process. Democratic senators had pressed Bondi on the temporal proximity of these events, questioning whether the contribution had influenced her prosecutorial decision. Bondi had maintained consistently that no connection existed between the contribution and her office's independent evaluation of the Trump University matter. She had provided documentation showing that her office's review process had followed standard protocols. She had cited legal opinions supporting her characterization of the jurisdictional questions that informed her decision not to pursue the investigation. Republican senators had defended Bondi's testimony, arguing that Democrats were attempting to criminalize routine campaign finance activities and normal prosecutorial discretion. They noted that attorneys general frequently receive campaign contributions from individuals and organizations that may subsequently become subjects of investigation. They emphasized that no evidence had been presented demonstrating that Bondi had made any commitment to Trump in exchange for the contribution. The partisan divide on this issue reflected broader disagreements about appropriate standards for evaluating potential conflicts of interest. What had not yet been revealed during the confirmation hearing was the full scope of financial transactions between Trump-affiliated entities and Bondi-connected organizations. The $25,000 contribution that had received extensive media attention represented only a small fraction of the total financial relationship that White House's investigation had uncovered. Additional payments, routed through various political action committees, consulting arrangements, and speaking fees, totaled an additional $822,000 over a 4-year period. These transactions had been structured in ways that avoided triggering reporting requirements that would have made them readily visible to journalists or opposition researchers. Equally significant was the existence of recorded telephone conversations between Bondi and Trump Organization attorneys during the period when her office was evaluating whether to pursue the Trump University investigation. Florida law required two-party consent for telephone recording, but one of the Trump Organization attorneys had recorded several conversations without Bondi's knowledge or consent, apparently creating a record that could be used for potential future leverage. When this attorney subsequently left the Trump Organization under contentious circumstances, they had retained copies of these recordings. White House's staff had obtained the recordings through a subpoena issued during their investigation. The combination of comprehensive financial documentation and contemporaneous audio evidence created an evidentiary framework that would prove impossible for Bondi to contest credibly. The financial records demonstrated a pattern of transactions far exceeding the publicly known contribution. The audio recordings captured conversations that contradicted key elements of Bondi's testimony about her decision-making process regarding Trump University. Together, these materials would expose not just an isolated campaign finance issue, but rather a sustained financial relationship accompanied by explicit discussions about prosecutorial decisions. The hearing room atmosphere reflected the gravity of the proceedings. Major news networks had devoted continuous coverage to the confirmation process, recognizing that the Attorney General position represented a critical appointment for any administration. Legal experts occupied seats in the gallery, prepared to provide immediate analysis of developments. Former Justice Department officials from both Republican and Democratic administrations monitored the proceedings, concerned about the integrity of an institution that required public confidence to function effectively. As White House prepared to present his evidence, Bondi's legal team displayed visible concern. They had prepared extensively for questions about the $25,000 contribution, developing detailed responses that emphasized the independence of prosecutorial decisions and the routine nature of campaign contributions. What they had not anticipated was evidence of a broader financial relationship or the existence of recorded conversations that might contradict their client's testimony. The procedural protections typically available to nominees would prove inadequate against the documentary and audio evidence that White House was about to introduce. Senator Whitehouse began his examination by establishing the foundation for the evidence he would present. He requested that Bondi confirm her previous testimony that the $25,000 contribution from the Trump Foundation represented the full extent of financial interactions between Trump-affiliated entities and her political operations. Bondi confirmed this characterization, reiterating that she had no knowledge of any other contributions or payments beyond the widely reported donation. This confirmation proved strategically significant. By reaffirming her previous testimony, Bondi committed herself under oath to a factual representation that White House's evidence would shortly demonstrate to be materially incomplete. The distinction between incomplete and false testimony would become a subject of extensive legal analysis in subsequent weeks, but the immediate impact involved the credibility damage resulting from the revelation of information that contradicted sworn statements. White House then introduced a comprehensive financial analysis prepared by forensic accountants who specialized in tracking money flows through complex organizational structures. The analysis documented payments from various Trump-affiliated entities to political action committees that supported Bondi's campaigns, consulting arrangements that provided income to advisors in Bondi's political network, and speaking fees paid to Bondi herself for appearances at events organized by Trump business associates. The cumulative total of these transactions reached $847,000. The hearing room erupted as committee members absorbed the magnitude of the discrepancy between Bondi's testimony and the documented financial relationships. Republican senators immediately objected that the analysis conflated routine political activities with improper payments. Democratic senators demanded that Bondi explain why she had failed to disclose the full extent of financial interactions when questioned directly about such relationships. The chairman called for order, but the procedural chaos reflected the fundamental challenge that Bondi now faced in reconciling her testimony with the documented evidence. Bondi's initial response emphasized that many of the documented transactions represented standard political activities unrelated to any specific prosecutorial decisions. She noted that political action committees routinely support multiple candidates through various mechanisms. She emphasized that speaking fees represented compensation for her time and expertise rather than payments intended to influence official actions. She maintained that consulting arrangements with individuals in her political network did not constitute personal financial benefits to her directly. White House allowed Bondi to complete her explanation before systematically addressing each component of her defense. He noted that several of the political action committees in question had been established specifically to support Bondi's campaigns and had received funding primarily from Trump-affiliated sources. He documented that speaking fees paid to Bondi had exceeded standard market rates for similar appearances by comparable officials. He demonstrated that consulting arrangements had provided compensation to individuals who simultaneously held positions in Bondi's official office, creating potential conflicts of interest. More significantly, White House presented email communications between representatives of Trump-affiliated entities and Bondi's political advisors that discussed these various payment mechanisms in the context of maintaining positive relationships during the period when Bondi's office was evaluating the Trump University matter. These communications, while carefully worded to avoid explicit quid pro quo language, established a clear connection between the financial arrangements and the ongoing prosecutorial decision-making process. The temporal correlation between these payments and key decision points in the Trump University evaluation proved particularly damaging. White House displayed a timeline showing that significant payments had occurred within days of meetings where Bondi's staff discussed the Trump University investigation. While correlation does not establish causation, the pattern created a circumstantial case that the financial relationships had been structured to influence prosecutorial decisions. Republican senators attempted to defend Bondi by noting that she had ultimately not pursued charges against Trump University, suggesting that if improper influence had been exercised, it had failed to produce the desired outcome. However, this argument inadvertently conceded the premise that the financial relationships had been intended to influence prosecutorial decisions. Democratic senators immediately seized on this concession, arguing that the ethics violation existed regardless of whether the influence attempt succeeded. Bondi requested an opportunity to review the financial documents and email communications before responding substantively. The chairman granted a brief recess, during which Bondi's legal team attempted to develop a coherent response strategy. The challenge they faced involved reconciling Bondi's sworn testimony about the limited nature of financial relationships with documentary evidence of extensive transactions. Any response that acknowledged the broader financial relationships would effectively concede that previous testimony had been materially misleading. When the hearing resumed, Bondi attempted to draw distinctions between different categories of payments. She argued that contributions to political action, committees that supported her campaigns, could not be characterized as personal financial benefits. She maintained that speaking fees represented legitimate compensation for professional services. She emphasized that consulting arrangements with her political advisors did not constitute direct payments to her. The technical accuracy of these distinctions did not address the substantive concern about whether the cumulative effect of these financial relationships had created improper influence over prosecutorial decisions. White House systematically dismantled each distinction Bondi attempted to establish. He noted that political action committee support directly benefited her electoral prospects and therefore represented valuable consideration. He demonstrated that above-market speaking fees constituted a form of compensation that exceeded the value of services provided. He showed that consulting arrangements with her advisors created financial incentives for those individuals to maintain positive relationships with Trump-affiliated entities, potentially influencing the advice they provided to Bondi regarding prosecutorial decisions. The questioning had already substantially damaged Bondi's credibility, but White House had not yet introduced the most devastating evidence. The financial documentation established a pattern of relationships that contradicted Bondi's characterization of limited interaction. However, the audio recordings would provide direct evidence that prosecutorial decisions had been discussed in the context of maintaining positive relationships with Trump interests. As White House reached for the audio recording device, the hearing room fell silent. Experienced observers recognized that audio evidence typically carried persuasive weight that exceeded written documentation. The prospect of hearing Bondi's actual words discussing prosecutorial decisions in connection with financial relationships created an atmosphere of intense anticipation. Republican senators exchanged worried glances, uncertain about what the recordings might contain, but recognizing from White House's demeanor that the content would prove highly damaging. Senator Whitehouse held the audio recording device with deliberate care, establishing the context before playing the recorded conversation. He explained that Florida law required two-party consent for telephone recordings, but that one party to the conversation had violated this requirement by recording without obtaining consent from the other participants. He acknowledged that the recording had been obtained through a legal subpoena process during the committee's investigation. He noted that while the original recording might not be admissible in a criminal proceeding due to consent issues, it remained relevant for congressional evaluation of a nominee's credibility and fitness for office. The preliminary explanation served multiple purposes. It preempted objections about the recording's legality by acknowledging the consent issue while establishing that congressional oversight possessed different evidentiary standards than criminal prosecutions. It built anticipation about the recording's content by emphasizing its significance sufficiently to warrant discussion of potential legal complications. It demonstrated White House's thoroughness in addressing procedural questions before they could distract from the substantive evidence. Bondi's attorney immediately objected to the introduction of a recording made in violation of Florida's two-party consent requirement. The attorney argued that using illegally obtained evidence in a confirmation hearing set a dangerous precedent that could encourage future violations of privacy laws. The attorney requested that the recording be excluded from consideration and stricken from the record. The objection reflected standard defense tactics, but it also revealed the legal team's concern about the recording's content. The chairman consulted with the committee's legal counsel before ruling on the objection. The consultation lasted several minutes, during which whispered conversations occurred throughout the hearing room. Eventually, the chairman announced that the recording would be admitted for the committee's consideration, noting that congressional oversight authority encompassed review of relevant evidence even when that evidence might face admissibility challenges in other contexts. The ruling effectively ended Bondi's ability to prevent the recording from being heard by the committee and the watching public. White House provided additional context before playing the audio. He identified the participants in the recorded conversation as Pam Bondi, then serving as Florida Attorney General, and Michael Cohen, then serving as an attorney for the Trump Organization. He noted that the conversation occurred on September 17, 2013, during the period when Bondi's office was evaluating whether to join the multi-state investigation of Trump University. He emphasized that listeners should pay particular attention to the explicit discussion of the ongoing prosecutorial decision in the context of maintaining positive relationships. The audio recording began with routine pleasantries between Bondi and Cohen, establishing their familiarity with each other. The audio quality suggested a telephone conversation recorded from one party's device. Background noise indicated that Bondi had been in her office, with occasional sounds of other staff members in adjacent spaces. Cohen appeared to be in a quieter environment, possibly his own office or vehicle. After approximately 30 seconds of preliminary conversation, Cohen raised the subject of the Trump University investigation. His exact words, captured clearly on the recording, were, "We understand that your office has been receiving some complaints about the Trump University program. We wanted to reach out directly to discuss the situation and see if we can provide any information that might be helpful in your evaluation." Bondi's response came after a brief pause. "Yes, we have received some constituent complaints. My staff is conducting a review to determine whether Florida has sufficient evidence and jurisdiction to warrant joining the investigation that some other states are pursuing." The conversation continued with Cohen providing what he characterized as context about Trump University's operations. He emphasized that the program had provided valuable educational services to participants. He noted that some participants in any educational program inevitably feel disappointed if their expectations are not met. He suggested that the complaints Bondi's office had received reflected unrealistic expectations rather than fraudulent practices. Bondi's responses during this portion of the conversation remained professionally neutral. She acknowledged the information Cohen provided. She noted that her office would need to complete its independent evaluation. She did not make any commitments about the outcome of that evaluation. This portion of the conversation, considered in isolation, would not have created significant problems for Bondi's confirmation. However, the conversation then took a turn that would prove devastating. Cohen stated, "We really appreciate your office taking the time to conduct a thorough review. Mr. Trump has tremendous respect for you and the work you're doing in Florida. He's been very supportive of your re-election efforts and wants to continue that support going forward." The explicit connection between Trump's support for Bondi's re-election and the ongoing prosecutorial evaluation created an immediate problem. Even without Bondi responding affirmatively to this statement, the fact that it had been made during a conversation about an active investigation established an inappropriate linkage between campaign support and prosecutorial decisions. Bondi's response compounded the problem significantly. Rather than rejecting the inappropriate connection or ending the conversation, she stated, "Please tell Mr. Trump that I appreciate his support very much. It makes a real difference in Florida politics to have backing from respected business leaders. I want to make sure we handle this review in a way that's fair to everyone involved." The phrase, "fair to everyone involved," would become the subject of extensive analysis. Bondi would later claim that she had been referring to fairness in the prosecutorial process, ensuring that all evidence was properly evaluated before reaching conclusions. However, in the context of a conversation that had just explicitly linked campaign support to the ongoing investigation, the statement could reasonably be interpreted as a commitment to reach a conclusion that would be acceptable to Trump's interests. The most damaging portion of the conversation occurred in the final minute of the recorded segment. Cohen stated, "I think we're all on the same page here. We'll make sure that the support continues, and we trust that your office will reach the right conclusion after completing the review." Bondi responded, "I think we understand each other. I appreciate the call, and please give my regards to Mr. Trump." The exchange captured on the recording effectively destroyed any credible defense that Bondi's decision regarding Trump University had been made independently of financial considerations. The explicit reference to continued support, followed by Bondi's acknowledgement that they understood each other, created a clear inference that an implicit agreement had been reached. While the conversation avoided explicitly illegal quid pro quo language, the substantive content established a corrupt bargain with sufficient clarity to disqualify Bondi from serving as Attorney General. As the recording concluded, the hearing room remained silent for several seconds. The shock of hearing the actual conversation exceeded the impact that a written transcript would have provided. The tone of the participants' voices, the casual nature of the corrupt discussion, and Bondi's clear awareness of the inappropriate nature of the conversation combined to create devastating evidence. Senator Dick Durbin, the senior Democrat on the committee, was the first to speak after the recording ended. His voice carried controlled outrage. "Mrs. Bondi, we have just heard you discuss an active criminal investigation with the target's attorney while explicitly acknowledging his campaign support and committing to handle the matter in a way that would be acceptable to him. How can you possibly maintain that your decision regarding Trump University was made independently?" Bondi's face had lost color during the playing of the recording. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness table. Her attorney whispered urgently in her ear, but she waved him away. When she spoke, her voice lacked the confident tone that had characterized her previous testimony. "Senator, that conversation did not reflect any commitment to reach a particular conclusion. I was simply acknowledging that we would conduct a fair review, as we would for any matter brought to our office." The response satisfied no one. Democratic senators immediately began speaking over each other, demanding that Bondi explain how she could characterize the conversation as appropriate. Republican senators sat in stunned silence, recognizing that the audio evidence had eliminated any realistic possibility of defending the nominee. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly, but the hearing room had descended into chaos. Senator Lindsey Graham, typically one of the most reliable Republican defenders of Trump administration nominees, leaned into his microphone. "Mrs. Bondi, I need to tell you that I'm deeply troubled by what I just heard. That conversation crossed lines that should never be crossed. I don't see how you can continue with this nomination." Graham's statement represented the effective end of Bondi's confirmation prospects. When a senior Republican senator, who had previously expressed support for the nominee, publicly withdrew that support based on evidence presented during the hearing, the political calculation shifted decisively. Other Republican senators would now feel empowered to oppose the nomination without facing accusations of disloyalty to the administration. White House had one final piece of evidence to present. He displayed a financial record showing that within 72 hours of the recorded conversation, a Trump-affiliated political action committee had made a $100,000 contribution to an entity supporting Bondi's re-election campaign. The temporal proximity between the recorded conversation and the substantial contribution eliminated any remaining possibility that the financial relationships and prosecutorial decisions were unconnected. The 88 seconds from when White House first played the audio recording until Graham's statement effectively ending the nomination represented the complete destruction of a confirmation process. The combination of comprehensive financial documentation establishing $847,000 in transactions and audio evidence of explicit discussions connecting those financial relationships to prosecutorial decisions created an evidentiary record that admitted no credible defense. Bondi sat at the witness table in visible shock, the reality of the situation evident in her expression. Her legal team gathered documents frantically, searching for some response strategy that might salvage the nomination. Republican senators consulted with each other in urgent whispered conversations, recognizing that they needed to distance themselves from a nominee who had been exposed as fundamentally corrupt. Democratic senators allowed the moment to unfold, understanding that no additional questions were necessary once the evidence had spoken with such devastating clarity. The immediate aftermath of the audio recording revelation produced several simultaneous reactions that reflected the multidimensional impact of the exposure. The hearing room experienced a procedural breakdown as senators attempted to process the evidence and determine appropriate next steps. Media organizations began broadcasting breaking news alerts, recognizing that a major confirmation had collapsed in spectacular fashion. Social media platforms experienced immediate surges in activity as users shared clips of the audio recording and reacted to the revelation of corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement. The chairman called for an immediate recess to allow committee members to consult with leadership and determine procedural paths forward. During the recess, Bondi's legal team engaged in urgent discussions with White House counsel representatives who had been monitoring the hearing. The strategic calculation involved determining whether attempting to continue the confirmation process served any purpose or whether immediate withdrawal represented the less damaging option for both Bondi personally and the administration generally. Republican senators held an emergency caucus meeting to discuss their options. Several members expressed anger at the White House for failing to identify the existence of the audio recording during the vetting process. Others focused on the immediate political necessity of distancing themselves from a nominee whose corruption had been exposed so comprehensively. The consensus that emerged recognized that continuing to support Bondi would create political liability for vulnerable members facing re-election campaigns. Democratic senators coordinated their strategy for the resumed hearing. They recognized that the audio evidence had effectively ended the nomination, making additional questioning unnecessary from a practical standpoint. However, they also understood that the moment represented an opportunity to establish broader principles about acceptable conduct for Justice Department nominees and to emphasize the importance of independence in prosecutorial decision-making. The White House issued an initial statement defending Bondi and characterizing the audio recording as a routine conversation that had been misinterpreted by political opponents seeking to obstruct the administration's nominees. The statement emphasized Bondi's qualifications and experience while asserting that her prosecutorial decisions had been made independently based on evidence and jurisdiction rather than financial considerations. However, the statement lacked conviction, and White House officials privately acknowledged that the nomination could not survive the exposure. When the hearing resumed after a 90-minute recess, the chairman announced that the committee would hear closing statements from members before determining next steps. The structure of closing statements effectively signaled that no additional examination of the nominee would occur, implicitly acknowledging that the confirmation process had reached a terminal point. Senator Whitehouse delivered a closing statement that systematically reviewed the evidence presented during the hearing. He emphasized that the combination of financial documentation and audio recordings established a clear pattern of corruption that disqualified Bondi from serving as Attorney General. He noted that the Attorney General position required an individual who could make prosecutorial decisions based exclusively on evidence and law rather than financial considerations or political relationships. He argued that Bondi's conduct as Florida Attorney General demonstrated exactly the opposite approach, subordinating legal analysis to maintenance of financially beneficial relationships. Republican senators who spoke during the closing statement period focused primarily on procedural concerns rather than defending Bondi's substantive conduct. Several emphasized that nominees deserved fair processes and that last-minute revelations of evidence created difficulties for proper evaluation. Others noted that the audio recording had been obtained through violation of Florida's two-party consent requirement and expressed concern about establishing precedents that might encourage future violations of privacy protections. However, notably, no Republican senator directly defended Bondi's conduct as captured on the audio recording. The absence of substantive defense reflected a recognition that the evidence admitted no credible innocent explanation. The procedural objections represented an attempt to maintain party unity and avoid appearing to endorse Democratic criticisms of the administration, but they did not address the fundamental problem that the recording had revealed. Democratic senators used their closing statements to emphasize broader implications beyond the immediate confirmation question. They argued that the Bondi nomination exemplified a pattern of the incoming administration selecting individuals whose loyalty to Trump exceeded their commitment to institutional integrity. They expressed concern that other nominees might harbor similar conflicts of interest that had not yet been exposed through investigative processes. They called for enhanced vetting procedures and more comprehensive disclosure requirements for future nominees. Senator Cory Booker delivered a particularly powerful closing statement that focused on the victims of Trump University who had filed complaints with the Florida Attorney General's office. He noted that these individuals had sought intervention from law enforcement to address what they believed was fraudulent conduct. He emphasized that Bondi's decision not to pursue the investigation had denied these victims access to justice. He argued that the revelation of financial relationships and recorded conversations demonstrated that the victims' interests had been sacrificed to maintain Bondi's relationship with Trump. Following the closing statements, the chairman announced that the committee would postpone any scheduled vote on the nomination pending further consultation with the nominee and the White House. The announcement represented a procedural courtesy that allowed Bondi to withdraw rather than forcing a formal vote that would generate additional negative publicity. Every observer understood that the postponement effectively ended the nomination, with the only remaining question being the timing of the formal withdrawal announcement. Bondi left the hearing room without speaking to waiting journalists. Her legal team issued a brief statement expressing disappointment that political opponents had weaponized routine campaign finance activities and private conversations to obstruct a qualified nominee. The statement did not address the substantive evidence regarding the connection between financial relationships and prosecutorial decisions. The defensive tone and lack of specific rebuttal indicated that no credible response to the evidence existed. Within 24 hours, multiple developments occurred that sealed the nomination's fate. 3 Republican senators who were members of the Judiciary Committee publicly stated that they could not support Bondi's confirmation based on the evidence presented during the hearing. The statements effectively eliminated any mathematical possibility of the nomination advancing from committee to the full Senate. Several conservative legal organizations that had initially endorsed Bondi's nomination withdrew their support, citing concerns about maintaining public confidence in prosecutorial independence. The administration announced that Bondi had requested withdrawal of her nomination to spare the Senate the necessity of conducting a vote that would create additional political controversy. The withdrawal statement thanked Bondi for her willingness to serve and praised her record as Florida Attorney General while avoiding any substantive discussion of the evidence that had destroyed the confirmation. The statement announced that the administration would select a new nominee and would implement enhanced vetting procedures to avoid similar situations in the future. The broader implications of the Bondi nomination collapse extended across multiple dimensions of American governance. The episode demonstrated that comprehensive financial disclosure requirements for nominees remained inadequate to reveal complex networks of transactions designed to avoid transparency. Legal experts called for reform of disclosure rules to require more detailed information about payments routed through political action committees, consulting arrangements, and speaking fees. The revelation that recorded conversations existed from Bondi's time, as Florida Attorney General raised questions about how many other public officials might have been recorded during discussions with parties who had interests in matters before their offices. Privacy advocates expressed concern about the implications of allowing such recordings to be used in congressional proceedings, even when obtained in violation of consent requirements. Constitutional scholars debated the appropriate balance between privacy protections and congressional oversight authority. Former Justice Department officials from both Republican and Democratic administrations issued a joint statement emphasizing the importance of selecting an attorney general whose independence could not be questioned. The statement noted that the Bondi nomination had failed precisely because the evidence demonstrated that financial relationships had influenced prosecutorial decisions. The statement called on the administration to select a nominee with a demonstrated record of independence and to avoid candidates whose primary qualification consisted of personal loyalty to the president. The collapse of Bondi's nomination created immediate political challenges for the administration. The Attorney General position represented one of the most important appointments in any presidential transition. The failure of the initial nominee, after such a comprehensive exposure of corruption, created perceptions of inadequate vetting and poor judgment. The administration faced pressure to select a replacement nominee who possessed unquestionable integrity and who could withstand intensive scrutiny during confirmation proceedings. Several potential replacement nominees reportedly declined to be considered after witnessing the Bondi confirmation collapse. The extensive investigative process that had produced the damaging evidence created concerns among potential nominees that their own records might contain information that could be weaponized during confirmation proceedings. The administration's reputation for valuing loyalty above competence or ethical standards created additional hesitation among qualified candidates who worried about reputational damage from association with a potentially scandal-plagued administration. The Democratic investigative strategy that had produced the evidence exposing Bondi's corruption became a template for evaluating future nominees. Senate Democratic staff significantly expanded their financial analysis capabilities, hiring forensic accountants and investigators to track complex transactions. They developed systematic approaches to identifying audio and video recordings that might capture nominees discussing official matters in compromising contexts. They coordinated with journalists and advocacy organizations to share information about potential problems with nominees. Republican senators expressed frustration with what they characterized as intrusive and politically motivated investigations that went beyond appropriate oversight. They argued that the standards Democrats applied to Trump administration nominees would make confirmation of any candidates impossible. They warned that Republicans would employ similar tactics when evaluating Democratic nominees in future administrations. The escalating confirmation battles reflected broader deterioration in the norms and customs that had traditionally governed the Senate advice and consent process. Legal scholars analyzed the specific evidence that had destroyed Bondi's confirmation to identify the elements that had proven most damaging. The consensus that emerged emphasized that corruption cases require documentation of the connection between financial benefits and official actions. The audio recording had provided this connection with unusual clarity, eliminating the ambiguity that typically allows officials to claim that timing of contributions and decisions represented mere coincidence. Future investigations would search for similar recorded evidence that could establish explicit linkages. The victims of Trump University, who had filed complaints with the Florida Attorney General's office, expressed vindication that Bondi's misconduct had finally been exposed. Several victims filed civil lawsuits seeking damages, arguing that Bondi's decision not to investigate had been made for corrupt purposes and had caused them continuing harm. The legal viability of these suits remained uncertain, but they represented an attempt to obtain accountability through litigation when the criminal justice system had failed to act. The Florida legal community divided in its assessment of the evidence and its implications for Bondi's reputation. Some attorneys who had worked with Bondi during her tenure as Attorney General expressed shock at the recorded conversation, stating that such explicit discussion of campaign support in connection with prosecutorial decisions contradicted their understanding of her character. Others suggested that the conversation reflected common practices in Florida politics and that Bondi had been unfairly singled out for conduct that occurred routinely without consequence. The broader impact on public confidence in prosecutorial independence represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the episode. Public opinion polling, conducted after the confirmation collapse, showed that substantial majorities of respondents across partisan affiliations believed that campaign contributions influenced prosecutorial decisions. The evidence from Bondi's confirmation hearing had validated widespread suspicions that corruption pervaded the intersection of politics and law enforcement. Restoring public confidence would require systemic reforms addressing campaign finance, transparency, and accountability. Several state legislatures initiated investigations into whether similar patterns of corruption existed in their attorneys' general offices. Reformers called for stricter regulations governing contact between attorneys general and potential targets of investigation. Ethics experts proposed enhanced disclosure requirements and cooling-off periods between receiving campaign contributions and making decisions regarding matters affecting contributors. The momentum for reform reflected recognition that the problems exposed in Bondi's case likely existed more broadly. 1 year following the confirmation hearing, academic studies began analyzing the episode as a case study in how oversight mechanisms can function effectively when investigators possess both authority and resources. Political scientists noted that the Bondi investigation succeeded because it combined comprehensive financial analysis with access to recorded conversations that eliminated ambiguity about the nominee's intentions. The studies emphasized that effective oversight required sustained investment in investigative capacity and willingness to pursue evidence wherever it led. For individuals seeking to understand how accountability mechanisms operate in contemporary American governance, the Bondi confirmation collapse provides instructive lessons. The episode demonstrated that comprehensive documentation, combined with contemporaneous audio evidence, can overcome defensive strategies that rely on claiming coincidence or asserting that critics have misinterpreted events. It illustrated how senators from the nominee's own party will abandon support when evidence of misconduct becomes undeniable. It revealed the power of recorded conversations to establish facts that might otherwise remain subject to dispute. The significance of the 88 seconds during which the audio recording played and Senator Graham withdrew support extended beyond the immediate question of whether Pam Bondi would become Attorney General. Those 88 seconds represented a moment when evidence overcame partisan loyalty, when documentation defeated denial, and when institutional integrity prevailed over political expediency. The lasting impact will be debated by scholars and practitioners attempting to understand whether the episode represented an aberration or whether it established a new standard for accountability. For viewers interested in continued analysis of confirmation processes, investigative oversight, and the mechanisms through which public officials are held accountable, subscription to this channel ensures notification of subsequent content. Please share your perspective in the comments regarding whether the evidence presented justified blocking Bondi's confirmation, or whether the investigation represented excessive intrusion into routine political activities. Your engagement contributes to the democratic dialogue about appropriate standards for evaluating individuals seeking positions of public trust.